Hey, this is Nick Millivoy,
And this is Jason Shadrick.
and this is the 100 Guitarist podcast, where each week we're talking about one of the 100 guitar players that we think you should know. Jason, who are we talking about today?
Today we are talking about Uncle Jerry himself, Jerry Garcia, the Grateful Dead. And much like a good dark star, this podcast could go a ways. It could get out of hand.
Oh, we'll see about that.
Yeah,
That depends on your dark star taste, buddy.
that's true.
All right, before we get into all this, we'd like to remind you that you can get at us, shoot us an email to 100, that's 100, guitarists at premierguitar.com, or we love voicemails. Call 319-423-9734. We love to hear from you. You don't have to be worried you're going to call that phone number and somebody's going to answer. Nobody's going to answer. You just leave us a voicemail, and if it's something good, we're going to play it on our next episode. You can also shoot us a text, and maybe we'll read it on the next episode. And if you're watching here on YouTube and you want to take us with you, don't forget you can also subscribe to our audio podcast wherever it is that you like to find your podcasts.
That's right.
I'm an Apple guy. You can find us on Spotify. Jason, where do you like to find
I'm
your
an Apple
podcasts?
guy. We're creatives. We can't be messing around with PCs or Spotify, I guess. But today's episode is brought to us by Epiphone and the Inspired by Gibson Custom Collection. And we are talking these new additions to the Inspired by Gibson Custom Collection bring premium custom shop tone and components to every stage. Featuring USA pickups, historically accurate Gibson open book headstocks, which I like that look on the Epiphones. One-piece necks, the Inspired by Gibson Custom Collection will elevate your playing to a whole new level. So you can check out the full Inspired by Gibson Custom lineup, a new tier of premium Epiphone models to complement our full array of instruments. You can hit that at the link below. But Nick, tell us about one specific guitar in this collection.
Yeah, so this year they added the 1963 Les Paul SG Custom with Maestro Vibrola. 1963 was the last year the Les Paul moniker was used on the SG Custom, and it was the first year for the Maestro Vibrola. The premium appointments that the model is known for are all present on this new one. Features mother pearl block fretboard inlays, custom split diamond headstock inlay. Also has 3 Gibson custom bucker humbucking pickups, hand wired to CTS pots, Mallory caps, switchcraft pickup selector toggle switch, and output jack. All that and more. You're going to check this out, see what this thing can do. Head over to epiphone.com or gibson.com.
So I would say it's safe to say, Nick, I'm probably the resident jam band guy on staff.
Mm-hmm.
I think
that is safe to say.
I think Charlie and I kind of hold that down, 1A, 1B, depending on what era of jam bandy you like.
Okay.
So when I saw that Jerry was coming up, I was like, this is it. Yes, Trey is going to be on the list. I'm just going to spoil that right now. It's going to be down the way a little bit, but don't worry, Fish fans. We will get to Trey. But today we're talking about Jerry. What's that?
I'm not worried.
No. But today we're talking about Jerry, and the big question I always get from people who know that I'm a jam band fan, know I like, the heady 20-minute songs, is like they pull up the Grateful Dead in Apple or Spotify, and they see, the albums, but then they see a laundry list of 70 live records or whatever it is.
Feels like 1,000.
Feels like 1,000, exactly. And they're like, just where do you start?
Mm-hmm.
So if somebody were coming to you, Nick, you're down getting a steak and cheese, whatever you call it down there, whiz with onions without, a person next to you in line is like, you look like you're into the Grateful Dead and can tell us where to go.
We don't say that here. We don't say any of that here.
Yeah. And they're like, Nick, you look like you're into the Grateful Dead. Where should I start with Jerry Garcia and the Grateful Dead? Where would you point them without knowing anything about them?
So I have also gotten this question a lot. I am not a jam band guy, but I know quite a bit about the Grateful Dead. and I am a Grateful Dead fan. But I come to this maybe from a different angle than you do. I am not a deadhead. I am not devoted to everything. If I think that something is not good, I'm going to call it out as not good. Jerry is not my uncle. Put it that way.
You have not taken the brown acid.
I have received this question. What's that?
You have not taken the brown acid.
I have no, absolutely not. So I have gotten this question a lot. And my absolute favorite place to point people, there are two places, one of which I revisited and might have second thoughts on. But my number one place that I'll say, I'll talk about both of them, is there is a version of Eyes of the World, the song Eyes of the World from the Grateful Dead movie. I think that is the best thing.
You shared that with me, yes.
Yeah, I think that's the best thing the Grateful Dead have ever recorded. I think, first off, the song is great. That is a classic part of the Grateful Dead's canon. Like, right? Like, would you agree with that? That's one of the top 5 Grateful Dead songs that people go to.
I always kind of refer to, in terms of like top songs for a band, the Jimmy Buffett theory. That
okay, tell me about this.
At every Jimmy Buffett's show he played for at least, I don't know, last 25, 30 years, there are 8 songs he has to play at every show, basically. Margaritaville, Fins, blah, blah, blah. Now,
the Grateful Dead don't have any song that they play
exactly
at every show.
But if they did, if you know, the Dead were like a Buffett or the Eagles or whatever, and you wanted to come and you just wanted to hear the hits, would Eyes of the World be in the top 8? Yes, I would say yes.
Yeah. If it's not in the top 5, it's only because it's so long. But like Eyes of the World has some great musical elements. Like, I guess for me, people coming to me to ask about this stuff are normally fellow musicians who don't like the Dead, but they're music people, right?
I don't say they don't like it. I think people are just like, how did a band like this? Why do so many people like a band like this?
Yeah.
They're trying to figure it out.
When I'm thinking
much like
about,
me and Neil Young.
What's we'll get there. That's going to be a good one. Look out, folks. That'll be a good episode. So like Eyes of the World has some great elements, great chord progression. It has a key change in there. If you listen to the specific version I'm talking about, it has a meter change in there and lots to improvise over, lots of stuff to dig into. And they go to these different places, and it's there's a lot of depth to it. It's a dense song. I think that version is great. There are lots of other great versions. That doesn't have to be the place you go to get the vibe. And so if you don't know from that movie, you can also find it streaming. There's a box set called So Many Roads, and So Many Roads has a bunch of different. It was when I bought it in college, a 5-disc CD, 5 CD set, of live selections, and that was on there. There's also a version of That's It for the Other One, Into the 11, that is on there that I really, really like. And I have sent that to people who are music heads, guitar people, who are, maybe Jerry is a little too soft for them. Maybe the Dead are a little bit too light for them. And this is just this raw, nasty version. It starts, they're a mess. They're complaining. You hear them talking before, and they're trying to get in tune. And Jerry Garcia gets on the mic, and he's saying, "It's really weird, man. It's really weird up here. If you ever want to experience something, totally weird, totally beyond the pale," he says, "come on up here under similar circumstances and see what we're going through." And you just hear they're a mess. They're tuning drums still, and they're in front of an audience. And then they start playing, and they're all out of tune still. Like, it's still just a mess. But then there's this part where Phil Lesh kicks in his bass, and he goes, and they all come in. And then it's like off to the races. They're still a mess, but it's awesome. It's triumphant in the way that like cool improvised music is triumphant. I came back to it, and it is looser and more raw and dirty than I remembered. That I had sort of elevated that to this really high point in my brain.
And that was
anyway, those 2 tracks. That's exactly what I point to people.
So that track off So Many Roads, what year are we talking about when they did that?
69. So that's like same era as
very
their album
psychedelic.
Live Dead. Yeah, it's live dead, period.
Yeah, gotcha. Well, speaking of tuning, there is this great. I'm sure if you Google this, you'll find it. There is a great supercut of a 3-hour track of just the Dead tuning, just tuning for 3 hours.
If you ever want to just vibe,
play that for somebody. Be like, this is this must be the most in tune band ever, ever.
So what do you point people to, Jason?
I would point people to late 70s live Dead.
Disco Dead.
No, Disco Dead is a very specific niche, but the late 70s stuff, even when you get to like, basically Cornell 77, 5/8 77.
Which is great.
It's great.
It's great.
There's a reason why they consider that the best show they ever played, or at least the fans do. There's a lot of mythology around that show. They recently put out, it's on streaming now, so it's a little easier to get a hold of it. But I mean, that album just has so many hits on it, and so many hits, and there's so much mythology around that record that, it's like basically their greatest hits: Deal, Jack Straw, Loser, Scarlet, Fire, Saint Stephen, Morning Dew, One More Saturday Night. Like all the big, it'd be hard pressed to go to pick a random Dead show, I would think, in their last 25 years of existence and not hit at least a couple of these songs. They did, even a Merle Haggard, they did Mama Tried. So that's where I would go first, and then see what their response is. If it's like, it's a little too heady, then I'd push them more towards like Shakedown Street or even the 90s stuff, Touch of Grey, But if they want but if they're like, oh, this is great, I want more of the jams, then I'd push them back towards late 60s, early 70s stuff. But this was probably my favorite era of Jerry's playing, was this 77. Basically, I would say Europe 72 to 81, like 72 to 82 was the period of Jerry Garcia that was my favorite.
So what we're getting into right here, if somebody's listening who's not a Dead person, I think we're starting to scare them away, because one of the things about the Grateful Dead is that people start going down this route of like people who are into the Dead get into talking about different eras of the Dead. You have to hear this, you have to hear this. And I just want to I think we should touch on that a little bit. Basically, that like the Dead have this like extensive studio output, but Working Man's Dead, American Beauty, these are great albums. But what people mostly think of when they think about the Grateful Dead is not what is on those albums or on any of the albums. And there are other cool albums, I think. I like some Studio Dead stuff. But it's like somebody says, what do I listen to? And you say some date and place. You say like Cornell 77. Okay, a casual person who's not yet a fan, right? I think then you're already asking a lot from them. But the reason is that like the albums are spotty. The albums were produced under, sometimes weird circumstances, and sometimes that's not where the Dead thrived. Yeah. So maybe we can unpack just like a loose idea of the eras. I think about the Grateful Dead as a long-standing baseball team, right? Like, the Phillies are not great. The Phillies are my team. They're not great every year. They're not great for years in a row. And then they're really great. They get hot for a few years, but then some years they're great for part of the year, not the rest of the year, unfortunately. The Grateful Dead are like that. You can say like this, listen to X, and then somebody goes and finds something terrible. It's a percentage thing, right? Like they only succeed some percent of the time. And part of that is like they're not Huey Lewis. They're not going up there just like cranking out a tight set that they do every night. Nope. They're doing something different every night. And they're a ragtag ensemble, like a baseball team. There's like a little bit too many people in the band. Maybe they have too many drummers. Some
might say
there's one too many drummer
That's right.
in the band.
And
personally, my favorite eras are the ones that only have one drummer.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the years. What is your favorite era of the Grateful Dead?
72 to 82. Like,
Okay. So how would you, that's kind of a couple periods, the 72 period, the late 70s period, and the early 80s period. They're all different sounds. So do you want to take those?
yeah, I mean, basically from, I'm looking at their discography now, starting with Working Man's Dead, American Beauty, like two of the best country records of all time.
Country rock records.
Of all time,
Yeah.
right? Great songs on there. Those are probably the two most playable Dead albums. Like you can sit and just put it on and check them out, right? Europe 72 was a high point. I liked Wake of the Flood. And then you get into like
Europe 72 is a live album with
Is
a
a
lot
live
of those
album.
tunes and other tunes that maybe weren't on an album or came from other things like a Garcia solo album or something like that.
right. I like blue and really like I view 72 to 78, you know, with Shakedown Street. Shakedown's probably the most fun Grateful Dead song to play ever. It's super fun. That's the pinnacle of Disco Dead, right?
Sure,
And then
yeah.
with in 80 and 81, like with Go to Heaven, Reckoning, Dead Set, that like to me is a bookend of like if all they put out was Working Man's Dead to Dead Set, I'm totally fine. I don't feel like I'm missing anything. You know, because some of that psychedelic
That is
stuff
kind
from
of
the
bulk
60s.
of their catalog.
But I mean, it's like the 60s stuff from 67 to 70. That was very like fiery and acid fueled psychedelic jams, you know, with some complicated progressions and tune structures or whatever. And then basically from 80 on, the last 15 years was like, they had their one big hit, you know, with Touch of Grey. You know, that's fine. You know, the Dylan and the Dead stuff, okay, cool, whatever. But that's the bulk of the era. And I don't get as so like granular when it comes to the eras. I feel like they're psychedelic, then they get into their country phase, and then they really, like 75 to 78, they really kind of find themselves as a live group and really have that dialed in. You know, and then in the 80s, a little bit less of that. And then when you get into the mid 80s, okay, they have the hit, and then it kind of just, they kind of maintain until 95, you know, basically is how I view it.
Yeah, I could I could see that. I will say, so for me, my favorite period, there's overlap there. I like the psychedelic stuff from the late 60s. I like the film, you know, recordings of them playing at the Fillmore. You know, and for me, it's like they did Mountains of the Moon is a great song that do Dupree's Diamond Blues, Mountains of the Moon, and then go into a spacey thing, play Dark Star and get really psychedelic, and then, you know, wherever they go for there, maybe St. Stephen or something.
Hit the bathroom during drum space.
And that stuff to me is like, it's raw. There's room for them to get really weird, really creative, lots of feedback, lots of noisiness. Is it the best psychedelic music? I don't know. Maybe not. But it's, you know, that might not be like my all-time favorite thing. But I think that is there's cool exploratory stuff in there. And when it's good, it's great. And Live Dead is the officially released live album of that, and there's a double disc Fillmore thing from right around Live Dead period. That stuff I love. But then for me, the most like enduring kind of stuff is Europe 72. Like you, I like the songs about gambling. I like Loser and Deal. You know, if they're playing Loser and Deal, Jerry's singing about playing cards, and he's soloing. Those are great chord progressions for him to solo over. Loser's super melodic, and then Deal is like that's like a Tin Pan Alley song or something. It's like out of the American songbook. And I love that stuff. It ties in it. And we'll talk about his, you know, what his style really comes from in a minute. But that's my sweet spot. I like Cornell 77 is great. I like early 80s. Brent Midland started playing keyboards with them, and I think that gave Jerry a jolt because he was such a great musician. And 81, we're talking the live albums, the official stuff from them is Dead Set, first Grateful Dead record I ever bought, and Reckoning, the acoustic album. I think that these are just like fantastic albums. You know, fantastic albums that go beyond, you know, not just fantastic Grateful Dead albums, but like really, really great albums. So for me, that's that's the deal. But everything after that, it's like it did feel like they were coasting after that. I
Mhm.
have my thought is late 80s, early 90s. By then, it's like they had all the sounds at their disposal that, you know, might have appeared on a Huey Lewis record, but they were working as a loose ragtag improvising ensemble.
Yeah.
Trying to put those things together, and it can be very disorienting to hear those sounds and that vibe together.
So we've talked about our favorite Dead eras, but as far as our favorite Jerry era and Jerry specific playing, and if we're talking, we're going to talk about his other non-Grateful Dead stuff here in a second. But in terms of just Grateful Dead albums, if you want to hear some prime Jerry, where do you go?
So for me, this is, you know, not to get a little too heady about this, but, you know,
Here we
going
go.
back to those two tracks that I mentioned, that the specific version of Eyes of the World and the specific version of That's It for the Other One. The way I listen to this, that really makes it all make sense to me, and that makes the Dead make sense to me outside of the songs about gambling and the country stuff. When he's really on, I hear Jerry and Phil Lesh in this counterpoint thing. And they're just improvising. And this explains Phil Lesh's playing for me. And so there's this scene in Phil Lesh's autobiography. He describes, I think it's late 60s. It's easy to find. I didn't look it up before we recorded, but they're jamming with Elvin Bishop is jamming. They're playing some like weird blues. And they're all totally, they're tripping. They're all dosed, and or at least Phil is. And he's watching Jerry, and he feels as though that there is a rainbow connecting him and Jerry and the notes that they're playing, and that they're just totally connected here. And as as like totally like acid vibe as this sounds, that absolutely makes sense to me as the way that they hear this stuff. They're improvising off each other, and the other guys are complimenting what the two of them are doing. And so for me, the best Jerry Garcia improvisations are when he and Phil are just like hooked up. And so that version of That's It for the Other One does that for me. But there are others, and you can hear it. It's like you hear it and you know that's what's going on. But just Jerry, when a good version of Loser is so melodic and it's so heartfelt, and he does that thing elsewhere. There's Jerry Garcia Band version, the Merle Saunders era, live at the
Keystone Corner. Yep.
And when he plays, and so that's not with any of the Dead guys. When they play Bob Dylan's Positively 4th Street, his melodic playing on that is just like, that stuff kills me. So that's my favorite stuff. How about you?
I could point to a couple of different things. One is the second set of Cornell, the Scarlet Fire on that. And I don't know if I can point to a specific one, but when he's really ripping...
Scarlet Begonias in the Fire on the Mountain, for those who aren't hip to the parlance of the Dead.
Scarlet Fire, that's all you need to know. And
I can translate. I got this.
When he's really ripping on Brown Eyed Women.
Oh man, like a great version of that song is some of the best.
Yeah, like when
Chef's Kiss.
That should like if there was any song in their catalog that should have been like a Hotel California level hit. I mean, like ubiquitous song that everybody, whether you're into the Dead or not, knows. It's Brown Eyed. I mean, Brown Eyed Women is such a great classic rock song. You know.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
classic
so good.
rock is maybe
it could be a
folk
classic.
rock
I mean, it could be a classic rock
staple.
staple.
Folk rock.
You know, so that to me is prime Jerry. And when I hear his tone, which maybe we should just dovetail right into it, that I like the mix of him having touch and sustain without having a ton of overdrive. You know, his tone is so clear and so specifically melodic. What's that?
It's very punchy.
It's very punchy. I had to think that had to do with like the Macintosh preamp setup that he was using with a twin or whatever it was. Because he'd have a twin reverb. He'd also use Macintosh.
It's twin preamp Macintosh power amp.
Yeah, Macintosh. that kind of combination just was like, okay, here's
Mm-hmm.
a massive amount of headroom, and he had some Boss pedals or whatever. There's a massive amount of headroom, and and it was his touch and his hands that brought out the clarity when he needed it, and also brought out the overdrive when he needed it.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're getting deep into this, and I think I just want to cover like what Jerry Garcia sounds like, what he actually sounds like when he plays. We have a couple messages to share, but like maybe we can just share our own interpretations first, like because I think when people get confused by like they listen to the Grateful Dead and they're like, what is this music? What is this? A lot of times it's like Jerry Garcia he's not playing with let's say a precise approach. It's sort of like splatter painting. He's playing all over the place. He plays a lot of notes. Super fluid, kind of just like always jamming, right? Lots of scale runs, lots of patterns.
He might have
stuff like
invented noodling, right? I mean,
yeah.
when people
Yes,
talk about
absolutely.
noodling in a jam band context, I don't think that
This is
term
where it
ever
comes from.
existed before Jerry. There's no way. No way.
But it's not just up and down scales. There is
Pause
a
right there.
reason he sounds like this. There's a methodology.
I wish I knew who told me this quote one time, but they said what made the Grateful Dead sound so good is that they knew when to go up the Mixolydian scale and when to go down. I was like, that's it. That's it. That's it.
Yes. Carlos Santana, you think about that's a different approach to like psychedelic music in Santana. He does all this big holding note stuff. That is the opposite of Jerry Garcia. Just think about Carlos, think about what the opposite would be, and you can get this Jerry Garcia. But to me, I think about Jerry's like playing vocabulary. And I think about, there's rock and roll in there. There's folk rock in there.
Jazz.
There's a jazz, not in vocabulary as much as like in spirit.
I
would
think it's
say,
in
and
in melodicism, wanting to
then,
play through
Phrasing.
changes. Yeah, play through
Yeah.
changes rather than.
but not Charlie Parker licks.
No, not Charlie Parker licks. No.
But the licks, to me, I think, and this is the part that really explains it all, is the licks are bluegrass licks. Like Jerry had this background in bluegrass playing old timey music, and that's where the busyness comes from, and that's where that part of his sound comes from. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, he started as a banjo player, or was a banjo player in his early days, and I think that perpetual motion, with the banjo player, they just never stop playing.
Exactly.
When he kind of translated that to the guitar, I think obviously he couldn't be as dense note-wise, but that kind of forward momentum melodicism always kind of permeated throughout his playing,
Yeah.
So we have some people. We have some messages for some people.
You wanna read this first one?
Yes. This is from James Bain. I believe I'm saying. He's a buddy from Des Moines, Iowa, fellow Iowan. Good dude, great player. Plays in a really good Allman Brothers tribute band. So he said, what does Jerry Garcia sound like? So he said, Jerry Garcia is a guy who created his own sound by throwing everything into the musical pot. John Coltrane, Bill Monroe, Chuck Berry, and so much more. Also, so much of his sound was created by the fact that he was initially a banjo player. James, you're reading ahead in the book here.
There
buddy.
we go.
He wasn't really a sustained overdrive kind of player. Also, even in his improvisations, the melody was the priority. He was led by the music and in turn led his band and their throngs of followers through some pretty sophisticated musical terrain. Yes, I will agree with everything James said there. The one thing that hangs me up a little bit, he wasn't really a sustained overdrive kind of player. I think he wasn't in the sense that we talked about with Santana, where he's like just hit. But his touch, if you gave him a Fender Strat or a Telecaster and a Princeton Reverb amp, he could probably make those things sound so sustaining. Like I think when some people say people just have like loud hands, I think Jerry just had like very sustaining hands. He could squeeze so much out of a note, and I think that's. And I've heard interviews with Mayer when he's talked about his process for getting into the stuff for Dead and Company is that each note had this blossom and this bloom to it, and I think that to me is what Jerry's approach is, because when I've really, like, from a player standpoint, tried to get into his playing, I wasn't necessarily trying to like learn licks. I was trying to like mimic the arc of his playing and mimic
Yeah.
the touch of
feel.
his playing and the feel of it and the phrasing, right? I wasn't sitting there like I would say even like a Clapton or Stevie Ray Vaughan, where you're like, you can play a lick and you're like, oh, I know where that comes from. For
Right.
Jerry, it was more his approach, mixing staccato notes, pull off flourishes of notes, and his phrasing through rather than, rote licks. So,
Yeah.
but James, you're spot on, buddy. You're spot on.
All right, so now we have another message from premier guitar contributor Mark Finkelpearl, who wrote a recent piece for us on Sun Amps. Mark has a lot of insights on the Dead to share. Here's what Mark has to say.
Hey guys, it's Mark Finkelpearl. Thanks for inviting me to call in about Jerry Garcia. I think when it really comes down to it, there are three things about Jerry that stand the test of time. The first thing is his music has spawned a whole host of players who strive for his tone and his feel. I call them the Garcia tone chasers. There are really dozens of guitarists out there who try and do this. Zach Nugent is one of them. Stu Allen is another, but there are many, many more. And that leads into number two. Jerry's really, truly a musician's musician. And that's a cliche, and it usually denotes someone who's obscure or has sort of a cult following. Think like Richard Thompson or somebody along those lines. But Garcia really transcends that. He and the Dead could fill football stadiums, and they were much more in the mainstream for musicians than, just being a hippie band from the 1960s. That ties into the third thing, which ties back to number two. Here's a good example of it. I know somebody on the inside at Bob Dylan's world. I can't say his name on the air, but I have it under good authority that, Bob really loved Jerry and loved the way that he interpreted Bob's tunes, both in the Jerry Garcia Band and in the Grateful Dead. And I know from my source that Bob still talks about Jerry Garcia and, recently has gone out of his way in 2024 on tour, if you look at his set lists, to cover the Dead in tribute to Jerry and Robert Hunter and the Grateful Dead. So those three things to me add up to a significant legacy that shows no signs of letting up. Jerry Garcia and the Grateful Dead have proved that they are going to be around for the next 100, 200 years, maybe just like the Beatles.
If we go back to Bob Dylan's 2009 album, Together Through Life, which included Mike Campbell, the subject of our previous episode, most of those songs were co-written between Dylan and Robert Hunter. And so, that speaks to exactly what Mark is saying there. I think that is deep. I think that is an important thing. Like Dylan, I mean, Dylan is Dylan like the poet laureate of like, the 60s America or more, or, he's, I revere Bob Dylan's work, right? And if Bob Dylan's, throwing Jerry Garcia a bone there, it's like there's depth there to that. That said, the Dylan and the Dead album, I do not recommend anybody go there. Don't
Hard
listen.
pass.
It's hard pass on that one. It's not that's not even worth checking out, maybe as a curiosity. But Jerry Garcia did great interpretations of Dylan songs, both with the Dead and with the Jerry Garcia Band.
Right. All right, so let's talk a little bit about his tone here and his gear.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been documented. We did a feature, man, was it over a year ago about the alligator?
Yeah, that was about a year and a half ago. That was for our Builders issue, the 2023 Premier Guitar Builders issue. I wrote a piece on Austin McNutt, the Fender custom shop builder, master builder, who built a recreation, who's building recreations of alligator, and it was like, it's super impressive. I totally recommend. I mean, it's a great story. That I recommend people learn about if you're interested in this stuff.
Tell me more. Yeah, really well written.
Oh, thank you. But the story of the guitar, I don't mean my writing of the story, but the
you don't
Jason
say. Oh, crazy.
Austin, like, that stuff fascinates me, is like, recreating guitars, and at some point, you read about this stuff and compromises are made, and it really seems like with that project, no compromises were made. They were faithfully recreating alligator as far as they could. Alligator was a Strat that I think it's off the top of my head, Graham Nash gave Jerry Garcia, and that guitar, for me, I mean, that each Jerry Garcia guitar, I think, represents something different to different people. To me, that represents my favorite period of the Dead. Strat Jerry is my favorite, and that's the Europe 72 guitar.
Mm-hmm.
That's what he was playing in the country period. So to me, that's the thing.
Yeah, I would say that they're with you. So there's been so much written about the tiger, alligator, all the different Doug Irwin models that they collaborated on. Just recently we saw there was his last rack was up for auction.
Yeah.
Right? And it was just like, oh, here's a Groove Tubes preamp, here's a Macintosh power amp, and 3 or 4 Boss pedals, a Mutron, and it was the size of a refrigerator, which I thought was real interesting, that he had the pedals mounted vertically, so he could walk over and just either engage them, I guess, or at the very least adjust the knobs.
Noodling. Do some pedal noodling.
Man. So yeah, I think,
a couple other guitars too, outside of the Irwin guitars and the Strat. There's the Guild Starfire, which, from what I could tell from the period that he used it, must have had tuning problems, because it never sounds totally in tune.
Right.
But I love that. And his Travis Bean.
Travis Bean.
I like Travis Bean. That's like a mid to late 70s era. I think he used it for 1 year pretty solidly.
And it's amazing to me that a band like that and a player like that, basically every guitar he used has spawned a cottage industry of people building replicas, whether it's the stuff they're doing with Fender, or even what John Mayer and PRS are doing with the Dead Spec, Silver Sky.
For anybody who doesn't know what that means, the Dead Spec Silver Sky, you wanna speak on that a little bit?
It's basically they put the Alembic booster in a hardtail Silver Sky, right? Is that my understanding?
Yeah, it's supposed to be, so a Silver Sky. It's supposed to be, almost like a Silver Sky take on alligator.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So hardtail with a boost, with the Alembic booster in it, right? Those are the two defining features that differentiate it.
I believe so.
Yeah. So, and it's how many different, tribute bands? I mean, there's a million Dead tribute bands out there.
Yes, there are probably 5 Dead tribute bands to one of whoever the next band that has the most tribute bands is.
There has to be, right? One of the best ones I've heard is there's one in Nashville called Bertha, and it's all drag queen Grateful Dead tribute band, which I thought was great. That was such a
That's awesome.
clever thing to do. But yeah, there's, I think, at least 2 tribute bands in my town, Grateful Dead tribute bands.
There are a lot around here.
So to summarize, as we both agree upon, the Grateful Dead are the greatest American rock band.
Do we?
With the deepest catalog.
I don't remember saying that part.
I'm pretty sure I heard us both kind of really unanimously agree on this.
They're the most prolific.
What does that mean, though? They just made the most music? I mean, that's like a participation trophy.
There's something else there. They're definitely. Yeah, this is the tough thing about it, right? Like, are they the most influential? No, they're not the most influential.
They're not the most influential.
Do they have, because their influence to me, okay, this is an interpretation. To me, their influence is like, has firewalls around it, right? Like their influence is that they've spawned the most people devoted to their music. And I think that is the thing about it. But it's like, does the Grateful Dead influence filter outside of that specific scene of people who are Grateful Dead people? It's like, I don't know that I hear Jerry Garcia's playing in people's playing as much as like a lot of other people, because it's this other thing. But they have the most maybe specific influence. How does that sound?
Well, it's like we just said, they have more tribute bands than any other band, and it's by an exponential factor. So something is affecting musicians enough to want to learn and play this music and keep the music going, right? More than the Beatles, right? Like they have more tribute bands than the Beatles, but nobody would necessarily say the Beatles are more influential, or the Dead was more influential than the Beatles.
No, but the Beatles, though, you hear the Beatles in so many different styles of music. You hear the Beatles in so many different musicians' own music. I don't hear the Dead as much in people's own music. So, like, okay, so
I got one loaded ready for you when you're done with your point.
Okay, like when it's just like natural that you're talking about the Dead, and then Fish comes up, and it's like Fish carry the torch from the Dead. Fish don't sound anything like the Dead.
Not musically,
right?
not
so
musically,
like,
but from community and business wise, yes, they absolutely did.
Yeah, but musically speaking, the Dead thing stays in its zone, right?
Yeah, but I think the Dead.
I'm open. Convince me.
I think the Dead, like anything we call Americana, anything that falls into that bucket, 100% influenced by the Dead. 100%. Now, I'm not saying they're influenced by the Dead by like, a 15-minute morning dew jam. But if we go back to Working Man's Dead and American Beauty, like those were the two prime albums that basically spawned a whole genre that we call Americana now.
They did and they didn't.
From Jason Isbell to Margot Price to Nathaniel Rateliff, like there are elements of Dead's music that go through that whole genre.
In any of those people, I wish this were a live call-in show. I want to take calls about this. I want to keep rolling. We got to do a live call-in show. So, sports radio style. So, like, to me, dissect the Dead's influence on any of those people separately from Crosby, Stills, and Nash, the Flying Burrito Brothers, any of the Dead's contemporaries that didn't, that were around at the same time.
Yeah, the Dead were better at it. Yeah, I mean,
I don't know if I'm going to say that the Grateful Dead were better at the Americana thing that is represented on Working Man's or American Beauty than Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. I don't know that I can go there with you.
I mean, Friend of the Devil, if you put that on the radio today, if it was a brand new song today, that would stand up way better than anything Crosby, Stills. Crosby, Stills, and Nash were more folky. Like, they probably influenced the more singer-songwriter. But when you talk about like...
But they also influenced the Dead.
Yeah, but in terms of like rock bands or Americana country artists, we're not talking about the pop country side of things. But that I think the Dead were a much bigger influence than anybody really understood until that whole genre kind of started to take off. So when we talk about the influence of the Dead, not only on Americana, but on so much other music, is that they came out with a tribute album 5 years ago, at least 5 years, maybe more than that, called Day of the Dead. Have you still not heard of this?
I have not heard of this.
So here's the list of people who are on Day of the Dead. War on Drugs, Phosphorescent, Jim James, Bruce Hornsby, obviously that's the National, Mumford & Son, Lucius, Bryce Dessner, Wilco,
Kurt Vile featuring Jay Mascis.
Who? VJ Iyer, Stargaze, Flaming Lips, Stephen
Loco
Malkmus.
with Bob Weir.
Yeah, see, like Bela Fleck, Local Natives, Lucinda Williams, Night Full of Diamonds. Like, there's so, like, I think this tribute band, like, really opened people's eyes to, like, wow, they're, Unknown Mortal Orchestra doing Shakedown Street, His Golden Messenger doing Brown Eyed Women. The Lone Below doing Direwolf. Like, that to me, like, those people wouldn't hop on a track like that if they didn't feel like some connection to this music. None of these people
I'm
had
not
to
saying
do
that
this.
there's no connection. I'm just saying I don't know that it is that they are who we can hold up as the most influential American rock and roll band. It's something else. It's a different thing to me than saying that. Like, they're like, okay, and any of those people you're talking about, like, the things that I think of as like tenets of the Grateful Dead sound, or specifically the Grateful Dead songwriting, I don't know if it's really in there. Like, even think about the Americana thing, the Americana-y songs that I'm talking about, like Deal, right? Like, Deal has this like Tin Pan Alley thing going on, the types of chord progressions. These aren't just like simple strummy chord songs. These are like a very specific tie to the American songbook that is like pulling different time periods of songwriting together. And I don't hear that in a lot of bands the same way that like, I don't hear those influences moving on. And granted, there are lots of things the Grateful Dead could influence musicians with, and they do, and they are obviously influential. It's just like, I'm not with you on the most influential rock and roll band.
Well, let's go to our Grateful Dead correspondent, David Lee Roth. And that sounds like he agrees with me, Nick. So I think we should just wrap this up.
I really wish we could find out what David Lee Roth thinks about the Grateful Dead.
He probably loves the Grateful Dead.
Buddy.
He probably loves the Grateful
Buddy.
Dead. So, all right. Well, we did it.
Tell us what you think.
Tell us what you think.
Call in.
Get at us. Let us know how right I was.
What do you think about the Grateful Dead's influence? What do you think about Jerry Garcia's playing? Are we missing something here? Or are we, overrepresenting something? We want to hear from you.
That's right. You can email us at 100guitarists@premierguitar.com. Links down below. Or text us, call us 319-423-9734.
And don't forget to subscribe, give us a rating wherever you check out your podcasts, and stick around, stick with us. Come check us out next week.
And thanks to Epiphone and Gibson for sponsoring today's episode. Go check out those new line of Epiphone inspired by Gibson custom lineup. Those are very cool. And we'll see you all next week.